So we have our scissors here. Of course, we want to use paper scissors. We don't want to be using fabric scissors when we are cutting out pattern pieces or cutting out paper. You just want to make sure you're using different scissors for each type of thing. We have an awl. So an awl is going to be useful for marking specific points. If we need to, just make sure that you're not poking through to your table, as you can puncture your table, of course, which would make drafting in the future even more of a challenge. And then the next tool is we have our tracing wheel. So you can see it's a little bit ominous looking. It has these very sharp spikes. I do not recommend you touch it. This is going to be used for truing darts. It's going to be used for transferring your patterns onto fabric. You can use it for all types of different things. And if you use it, for instance, for patterning and then transferring it to your fabric, you can utilize transfer paper. It comes in all types of different colors. It can be blue, red, or yellow. And if you press through with this wheel onto this fabric while you're just tracing over your pattern, it's going to leave those dots onto your fabric, which will make everything easier to cut out. And lastly, we have our notching tool. Well, second to last, we have our notching tool. So this is going to cut out what we call a notch, which we'll learn a little bit more about in the future lessons. And then we have, of course, our measuring tape. I prefer one that has a metal end like this. It's a little bit easier for me to measure with. However, something like this, which is retractable, also works. You just want to be careful with making sure your measurements are correct. Now, measurements are everything for pattern making. There's a lot you can do for measurements. You can follow measurements from the book, which is actually what I'm going to be doing. If you take a look on some earlier pages in the book, for me it's this page 41, you can see that on here there is open spaces for you to annotate all of your measurements for your form or for your model, whoever you're working with. But there's also a list of standard measurements from size 6 through 18. Due to the fact that I'm recording this and I have to be able to capture at least most of the pattern at any given point in time, I'm going to just be using the smallest measurement, which is for a size 6. My form here is a couture size 6 form, so my measurements will actually probably be a little bit bigger than this form. However, that is all to say you can use whatever measurements you want. I highly recommend you spend some time studying this book for these various measurements it calls out. It gives you very detailed tutorials on what each measurement is. We'll review a few today, but you want to make sure that you are paying attention to your measurements, you're taking them accurately, you're recording them accurately, and then additionally, when you are actually drafting your patterns, you want to make sure that I always recommend this, fill out the patterns, fill out the blank spaces on the pattern instructions with your correct measurements. So as you can see here on this page, there's blank spaces with parentheses numbers. So this one says measurement 19, for instance. If I go back to my reference page, if I can check what I filled out for 19 here, or I can check what is listed here as a standard measurement at 19. So this is going to allow me to not have to flip the page back and forth, and this is what I'm going to be working on today with you. So feel free to open up the book, follow along. I'm going to briefly explain some of these measurements, but I'm going to, for the most part, just be calling out which point is what and doing so with the draft. Now with measurements, of course I said they're important, and it's going to vary. So of course, if you're working on a different size, if you're working on a different dress form, there's going to be slight variations between everything. So if you're drafting along with me in this video, please know that your pattern pieces may look slightly different than mine. And that is okay. It's not necessarily cause for alarm. It's just that you want to be conscientious of this given you're working with different measurements. Now, basically, for us to work on our measurements, we need to just call out a few things on the form. This line here, the narrowest part, is our waist. It's also referred to as the waist arc. We have what will be our abdomen measurement, which is typically 3 inches below the waist. Now, below the abdomen is what we call the HBL, or the hip line, and that is this marking here. And you want to make sure this is parallel to the ground. So in a standard sense, this is typically 6 to 8 inches below the waist. On mine here, it's currently about 7. So that's about correct. You can again reference the textbook for more details on the measurements. But we're going to be referencing measurements that go from the center front, which is this front seam on the form, to the side seam, the center front to the princess line, which is this seam here, as well as the center back to the princess line and the center back to the side seam. Now, you want to make sure you're always measuring along the same side. So if I'm measuring the left side of this dress form, I want to make sure I'm measuring the left side of the back as well. And that is just because the body is a 3-dimensional thing, and so it is already possible for, of course, the back to be a different measurement than the front to be a little bit different than the back, and that can also be the same as your front left is going to be different than your front right. So there's all types of variation that can happen here. You just want to be conscious of that. Additionally, we're going to measure from our waist seam here down to our HBL, and that is going to give us our hip depth. And from there, once you've filled out all of these measurements based on the charts on the previous pages, and then you've annotated it onto your drafting page, you can then proceed into actually doing your draft, as we are going to now. So again, I'm going to be utilizing a Sharpie, and the reason for that is it will be much easier for you to see this on the camera. However, while you yourself are doing this draft along, either at home or in the classroom, you will definitely want to be using a pencil. So again, I'm going to be utilizing a Sharpie, and the reason for that is it will be much easier for you to see this on the camera. However, while you yourself are doing this draft along, either at home or in the classroom, you will definitely want to be using a pencil. And that's just so you can still erase. You want to be able to erase for the most part. Now, there is one additional chart on here, which is called the personal dart intake chart. Do read this as well as the comments for personal fit. This is basically just going to subtract the waist from the hip, and then the difference is going to determine how many darts you have. Now, a dart is, of course, functionally when you're folding in a corner, more or less, along an edge, which is going to help turn your flat piece of fabric or your flat piece of paper into a 3-dimensional object by taking away some of the excess or some of the intake along a certain edge. Now, we're going to begin by marking our A to B line. So this can be completely made up. This is just the length that you want for the skirt. And again, we're drafting what we call a skirt sloper. I'm just going to pick 20 inches. And a sloper is basically a bodice and a skirt that fits the form and fits the body. And once you have these corrected, you can use that to draft many, many, many garments from those two basic patterns. So up here is our A, and down here is our B. Okay? Now we're going to find our C, which is going to be along this line. For me, C is 7.5 inches. So I'm going to set my square here, and I can see 7.5 is here, and that is going to become C. Now we also are going to take our hip arc, our back hip arc, and we're going to add 1/2 inch, and the 1/2 inch is for ease. The draft instructions often tell you to add measurements for what we call ease or dart intake. And this is just so there's a little bit of extra fabric to help create shape, or that way it's not completely flush to the body where you can't breathe. So for me, my A to D, my D point is going to be up here. That should be 9 inches, 9 5/8 of an inch. So I'm just setting my L square against this line to be perfect, so I know it's square. And I'm going to go up here to 9 5/8 of an inch, and this is D. Now we're going to go down to C and B, and we're going to make that same measurement and square it out as well. So this is basically taking the widest point of the skirt, the hip, and it's going to create what is more or less a box, which is going to help us then refine our pattern, which this point is E, to be more shaped like an actual skirt. But we have to start here. So we're going to go here to B as well, 9 5/8. Okay, and this bottom point is our F. Now we're going to square all the way down through each of those points. So I'm going to make sure that I'm square up top. I'm hitting all of those points, which I am, and draw my line. Now we need to be over here, which is going to plot this point, which we're going to call G. So this is the center back hip depth. So again, on the form, that is going to be this point here from our waist down to our HBL. So for me, on my form, and from my measurements from the book, that is going to be 7 inches and 3/8. So I'm going to take 7 3/8, and I'm going to mark that point up there. This becomes G. Now we're going to do the opposite side. So before we move over to the opposite, we're going to annotate over here. Annotation and marking and labeling on patterns is crucial. For translating patterns over to fabric is also important, but it's important that way you remember. So we want to know, we want to mark that this is our hip, this line is our hip, this line from A to B is actually our side seam, and this line here is actually our center back. Now, when we have these marked out, it's going to help us when we transfer it over to fabric to know where is center back, where is the hip, where is the waist, and that's going to make it a lot easier for us. Now, we're going to go to the opposite side. So A to H, which is going to create this side, is going to be 9 1/8 of an inch. So again, I'm squaring up, 9 1/8. Okay, over here becomes H. We are then going to square out from C and B this equal to this measurement. So the 9 1/8 is going to come back again. Okay. Okay. Respectively, that is going to make our point I, as well as our point J. And we're just going to square down from H through to J. Again, making sure everything is square. Just want it to be completely perfect as much as possible. And that is going to roughly be our skirt. So from here, we can now begin to refine the actual shape. So we want to begin over here on our back and our front, but we of course want to remember that which side is which. So we want to label, so this is going to be our back, and this is our front. And since we've drawn this line, we can now label this one our center front. Now, we are going to plot our actual waist measurement, which for me is 8 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so my 8 3/8 is right here, and this is going to make a point that we are going to call K. Now, one of the measurements that you're asked to take and to pay attention to is your dart placement. And so that is going to go from your center front to your princess seam. And that is going to be our D to L. And so for me, D to L is 3 inches. So I've marked that here. I'm going to label L. And from when we did our personal dart intake chart, we know that the back should have 2 darts that are each 1 inch. So I'm going to label, I'm going to make 1 inch. So that is our first dart. That is going to be spaced out 1.25 inches. So I'm going to draw 1.25 inches away from that next line, and I'm going to draw 1 more inch. So I've marked out both of my darts here. And for that side, we are now complete once we square up and down from our point here, K. You'll see why we square there in just a moment. We will then go back to our front side and do the same process. So we're going to start with from H, and we're going to go to our point M. For me, that is 7 3/4 of an inch. And this is our front waist arc. So M we want to label here. And then we're going to do the same with the darts. So on this back side, we were looking at the center back to the princess seam. With the front, we're looking at the center front to the princess seam. So I'm going to mark my 3 inches, and that is going to become N. And then on our front, we actually only have 5/8 of an inch for our dart intake based on my size. And then those are also going to be 1.25 inches away from each other. So I've marked my 5/8. I'm now finding 1.25 inches. I've marked my second dart, and I'm going to mark 5/8 again. And those are our darts. We're going to repeat what we did over here for the back, in that we're going to copy and square up at M. Now for the next section, we're going to pick up our hip curve, and we're going to reference our side hip depth So side hip depth is of course going to be from your waist down to your HBL line or your hip line at the side seam. So for me, that measurement is 7 5/8 of an inch. And what I'm gonna do actually is I'm gonna start at C and I'm gonna place that measurement there. So as you can see, I have 7 5/8. And I'm going to put that measurement here and rotate my curve until it hits this line. And where it hits is going to actually become my new point, which we're going to call P. So here is P. I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. So again, we're looking at 7 5/8 of an inch for me on my measurement. I'm going to mark it and I'm going to draw the line. Excuse me, I forgot to draw. So you can see it's starting to look a little more skirt-like now. And you can see from there we can actually draw our waistline. So we're going to take this shallow end of our hip curve, so more so along here because it's not going to be super severe. It's not like our waist is going to go completely dipping like that. But we're going to, excuse me, this point up here is actually called Q. But we're going to draw from our point P over to G, and this is going to become our waistline for the back. So of course you can see it's pretty slight for me right now. It's also a little bit challenging with the Sharpie. However, all being said, you just want to make sure that you're hitting your points that you're calling out. So again, I'm just finding the shallow end of my hip curve that makes sense for this measurement, and I'm going to draw it out. So you can see my P goes slightly above, it's dipping below to where G is, and the same Q is slightly above M, which is going to straight towards H. Now we need to measure down from our back darts. So these ones here are 1 inch, of course. So we want to place we want to find the halfway point on our dart here. So we're going to find the 1/2 inch mark, since these are 1 inch. And then with the back darts, we want to square down 5.5 inches. So it goes to here, and then I'm going to do the same on this side. So this becomes the depth of our dart. Now, we want to correct this, of course, because we have our dart opening here, our dart leg here, and then we have our dart depth. So we want to confirm